Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am joined by Mr. Steven Greenhut. Mr. Steven Greenhut is the California columnist for UT San Diego. He was my boss back at the Franklin Center for Watchdog.org, and he's joined us today to talk about Uber and why Uber matters. Really, we're looking at how the market regulates better than regulators. Uber is a car-sharing service, an application that many people are using in cities all across the United States and around the world, and this is certainly upsetting taxi drivers. And we've seen a great tour de force from a lot of journalists who've tried to cover this issue, and from a lot of local newspapers specifically that get into the ramblings and the difference between the police monopoly and what Uber is doing. So how technology is changing everything. Tell us, Stephen, how is Uber changing things in local markets in California, and what does it mean for the market there?
I think, as you pointed out, the great thing about Uber, I've written a number of stories about Uber and taxis, and I have virtually no interest in the subject from a personal level. I get in my car and I drive, but it's a fascinating story about markets and regulation. And there's this assumption in our society, especially here in California, that the only way that you have a good, effective, safe system is by regulating it. So it's gotten so ridiculous here in Sacramento. There was a proposed regulations to require taxi drivers to shower and not wear sandals. Uh, Now, can you imagine that in Uber or any real market system? But but what's happened is the taxi. There's this taxi medallion system. The way it works now in most cities is the government caps the number of taxis that can be on the road. Can you imagine that in anything? Let's cap the number of bakers or butchers or whatever. So they cap it. So folks, these taxi companies buy these medallions, and sometimes in some places, like in New York, they cost I think like $2 million, and then they rent them to the drivers, and then you get this problem of it's not really a competitive system. So you have these drivers who rent these things and have a hard time making a living. And as we know, cabs are highly regulated. Everything about them is regulated, and yet they're gross, right? They're usually old cars. They smell like air freshener. Try to get, when I'm in San Francisco, outside of the core area, try to get a cab. Even when you call over and over, customer service is awful. It's just a mess. So here you have this market that isn't functioning, and along comes Uber by kind of playing. They're playing within the regulations. Outside the regulations, they've created this unregulated market system where it's a ride sharing service. Technically, I call up on my one of these cell phones, and I get a driver driving their personal car. They come, they take me where I want to go. It automatically gets deducted from my credit card. So the taxi industry has thrown them into a tizzy. I think in San Francisco, taxi rides are down like 65%, and it's mostly attributed to Uber, Lyft, Sidecar, some of the other ones. And what happens? The times I've used it, uh, you quickly get a person there. They don't even ask you where you're going. So if you're not going someplace they want to go, they're going to come anyway. Unlike taxis, the car's late model, the driver's friendly, the price is reasonable. Oh my God, this is so upsetting to some people in my business. But they charge more during prime times. Market pricing. Yeah, I'd much rather have a low cost taxi ride in San Francisco downtown during the rain at rush hour and not actually get the taxi, then get the Uber and actually have to pay a little more. So they have this congestion pricing they call it, which is just market pricing. Um, and it's nice. You get a text of the name of the driver and a phone number to reach the person and the license plate number to make sure you're not getting into somebody else's car. It's very nice and has what's causing this? Is it regulations? Did the city of Sacramento pass a rule requiring that Uber have clean cars and that their drivers actually shower? No, it's the market, right? There's it's that the drivers want to get high star ratings, or else they lose their job. They want to make more money. They want to get a better tip.
Yeah,
Uber wants your
it's the
business.
rating system, I think, that a lot of people don't recognize how important it is, and the competition. A lot of these drivers who've been driving for taxis, the companies have been there for a few years. They haven't really had much competition, and in a lot of places, the prices are regulated. So if you're going from the airport to downtown, normally it's a flat rate. They can't charge more, they can't charge less, they can't. If you go faster, charge a bit more. They can't do anything like that, and a lot of the taxi unions and the taxi companies have employed people to lobby on their behalf and make it so people are not allowed to use Uber services near airports. That happened to me in Los Angeles. The one time I went, my Uber driver had to be, almost 600 feet down the road, and he's not allowed to be at the pickup. And I've seen it in France where they're not allowed to wait there more than 5 minutes. I mean, there's all these regulations that have been introduced, not just because of the government, but because of a lot of the lobbying efforts of the taxi companies.
Right, because the taxi companies and the shuttle services, they're rent seekers. I mean, essentially, their business is dependent on a regulation, not on their ability to provide a service better. So they have to. In France, they require Uber drivers, don't they? Or at least one rules. Maybe it's one city, or that they have to wait a certain time period after being called before going to pick up the passengers. So it's punishing the passengers in order to give a leg up to the smelly, angry cab driver driving a beat up old vehicle. So yeah, the government's trying to hobble it. But what's interesting too, if you look at how the system that you describe, which yeah, it's all rate regulated. So there's very little incentive to, like when I lived in Washington D.C., the way the bureaucrats came up with the rate structure, it was very cheap to get a ride around downtown. So you hop in a car and a couple bucks to go across downtown. But the driver didn't get much money if they went up into the neighborhoods. So the drivers just wouldn't go into the neighborhood. So as soon as they found out that you wanted to go 7 miles uh, away from downtown, they wouldn't take you because they would only make a little more. They'd make a lot more, and that's because of the fare system. One thing I noticed that really epitomizes this situation is I go to use a credit card at a taxi in Chicago, and in Chicago they have to take credit cards, and so the guy brings out one of these things, one of those carbon things where you get the big metal thing like that, and put it on the paper, and then he rubs it, and I'm like, what is this, 1967? Maybe that was invented in 1973. I don't know, but they've got this 40-year-old system. Now, I just hired a guy to do some work around my house, and it's just a handyman guy. He pulls out his phone, and he's got this little $5 thing, and he swipes my card, and I sign it with my fingernail. Well, there's no incentive. In fact, the way the rules are written, the cab companies keep an additional amount of money when credit cards are used. So the drivers desperately want you to pay in cash. So this is a rule-driven system that punishes consumers. So anyway, the market, the big issue that the critics of Uber have focused on in the state legislature is insurance issue. There was a tragic accident by an Uber driver who was driving. He didn't have someone in his car, but he was waiting to get an assignment, and he killed someone. And so the taxi folks, who are, I don't know, not the brightest tools in the shed, often they're saying, well, look at the dangers. So I did a column, I did a little searching, and if you just search deadly taxi accidents, just do that on Google, and you'll have enough to write about for the rest of your career. So if they're going to make, so I wrote a piece called "Ban Taxis" because obviously they're dreadfully dangerous, which I think they often are, and all the background checking failed, and all this sort of stuff because we have this government like bureaucratic cartel system compared to what makes any of us provide a better good and service? Competition. We profit motive and competition. So they're focusing. Critics are focusing on that, and there was a gap in the insurance. I don't really have a problem with I think it'll fix itself, but I don't have a real big problem with mandating that drivers have a certain amount of insurance if they're going to drive on the road. Okay, take customers. In reality, when I did checking, I found that Uber drivers tend to have a lot more insurance than your taxi companies, which rely on government regulation, which makes them have far less insurance coverage than somebody might normally have, but they get a special protection. So a lot of that's bogus. I don't have a problem with basic safety things, but even cars, Uber drivers aren't required to have a inspection by the government, but Uber requires them to drive late model, decent, well maintained cars. Taxi drivers are required to have all these inspections, and yet it's the taxis that seem to be a big problem from a safety angle because, and this is part of the reason, there isn't much of a profit margin. So in San Diego, there was a study done, I think it was called Driven to Despair. Your typical cab driver gets $5 an hour. They take the cars, they drive them to their limit, right? Because they got it. If they put in the extra money to maintain the car, that's money right out of their hide. Um, and it's because there's a price control on it and a limitation that makes it very difficult. And also because that medallion system assures that the individual taxi driver cannot just go out and get a taxi and start their own business because they're a limited number. So the people who speculate in taxi medallions, they're basically, I compared them to urban sharecroppers. I was quoting someone else, but they're stuck on the plantation. They have to work for the owners of the taxi companies because they don't have the freedom because of a city rule to go out and buy their own cab and compete. So what they did in San Diego, which is really the best way to deal with Uber, and this is all driven by the competition from Uber, the city got rid of the medallion system. It said anybody, if you meet some basic standards, can have a taxi medallion and buy your own cab. You got to buy your cab. You still got to pay 20 grand for the cab or whatever, and pay a very small fee to the government rather than to buy this. In San Diego, it's like $120,000 for a medallion. And you can start your own business. And other cities have done that, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. And the result is, guess what? Competition. And it helps. So competition regulates better than government regulators. It's just as simple as that.
Point for a lot of journalists to take home as well is this role of technology that is started coming in. A lot of people, legislators especially, but a lot of journalists that I read, mainstream journalists mostly, don't really understand the technology behind this, and would like to point their fingers at Uber, but when you just take the app away, it's just people who would like a ride, and people are willing to offer them space in their car for a limited amount of time, and it obviously is a benefit for both the passenger and for the driver. And as soon as we start introducing these applications, the governments want to put these laws on, if they see the application being used, police might pull them over and might have to pay something. I was in Milan in Uber, and the drivers became very hostile when I started talking about the price and whether or not he could pick me up at a certain hour, because in Milan it's actually now illegal to even have Uber. And if any driver is caught driving an Uber car with the application, he's immediately fined up to 500 euros, that's about $700, and he might get his car impounded. So that's where people now are being put into a situation where they're criminals, basically, for offering a service that people like me and a lot of other young people I know who just don't have a car or just don't want to drive around, we're the ones who are seeking some kind of entry, some kind of car, anything, and it's the regulators who are putting a stop to that.
Yeah, it's nuts, and it's also a safety thing. I mean, if I love the idea that not that I'm too old for this, but you could go out to the bars and drink a little too much, and you just call Uber, and it's you would think that safety, but the whole thing. What I can't stand is this whole ethic now. I guess it's not just in the U.S., but it seems really bad here, and it's really, really bad in California that you just ban everything and control everything. So we have these new, different issue, but these new, what are those cigarettes? Those vapor? Yeah, they don't harm anyone. In fact, a lot of people who smoke cigarettes now can smoke these things. So of course cities are banning. They're busy banning anything, any idea you come up with immediately gets followed by a ban. Now there are certain market failure issues. I think that's usually almost always overstated. Market fixes things amazingly if you just let it. But okay, once in a while there's some issues that I think could fall into the legitimate concern of government officials. So if you were finding that you had a bunch of cab drivers who didn't have insurance, or I mean Uber drivers or whatever, well, okay, require that there's some basic ground rule. Require that I don't know. You could think of some rules. So if there's a problem that develops, um, well, by all means, try to deal with that problem. But instead, we seem to have taken this approach that we're just going to clamp down on anything that's different, anything that threatens any group of rent seekers, which is just a term for private sector actors who are just trying to use the government to maintain a economic advantage. So any interest group that gets angry about something, let's just shut down whatever it is, and then we don't just lose the jobs. We lose all the energy and all the niceties that happen from markets, and we turn more into, as I always say, that the government, everything in government ultimately resembles the Department of Motor Vehicles waiting room. That's ultimately where it always ends up. And it, like we have this government train system here that used to in Southern California where people would have a nice beer or martini on their way home from work. Well, they had to clamp down on that. So everything they have to clamp down on anything that's fun, anything that's enjoyable. Where markets are trying to win, we try to win competitive advantage. I try to write an article that's really enjoyable for you to read, or else I'll be out of work. The government doesn't care about that. There are no customers. You're just subjects, and subjects put up. Yeah, you're forced to be a customer. So the DMV, you have to pay for things you don't really want. So why do they care? So try to yesterday I tried calling my insurance company. It was like a 2 minute wait. I tried calling and insurance companies are highly regulated and aren't exactly market beautiful examples of the market. But then I try to call DMV for a question. It's a 2 hour wait. Uh, and then I'm sure if I actually waited, I'm, I'm guessing the answer might not. I couldn't have taken that answer to the bank either because you get what you get when you call a government agency. There is no customer service because there are no customers, and and so anyway.
Another point that you brought up about interest groups, just before we end, I think a lot of people have been covering Uber in the news. There are a lot of small incidents that happen. I believe there was a rape of a woman in India that happened between, it was an Uber driver who was accused, and big uproar over whether Uber is doing enough background checks and such. And we've also seen a huge slew of articles about Uber, just critical about everything, talking about the inner management, and a lot of this stuff has actually been done by some of its competitors. And I think a lot of, especially reporters in Silicon Valley, really just get caught up in this whirlwind and realize they don't realize that they're doing someone else's bidding. So that again speaks to the theme of staying independent, of trying to verify your sources and not just going off of one easy tip from someone. And it's obviously in their interest to have someone write about how Uber is trash talking women in its leadership, or it's very tough on women drivers, all these kind of things. So while it might be the government, there's also plenty of industries who would just love to use your pen or your keyboard for that matter and try to win advantage. And I think it's always important for journalists to at least recognize that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I get one competitor sends me trash about Uber on their email. They email me, and I call them and like to give them a hard time about it. But yeah, and then Uber. I mean, I'm sure there's things they do that are terrible and things, whatever. But yeah, realize who is pitching the stories. That doesn't mean it's not necessarily legitimate. But and these, yeah, you're right about the government. Obviously, it's the government rules that are the problem. But all these so-called private actors are the ones that abuse these rules for their own financial gain. So
And
just because,
all they can do is react to the laws imposed upon them. If they are legitimate actors, unless they're the ones lobbying, then they're just rent seekers, as you said.
yeah. So these taxi companies, the taxi owners are some of the worst offenders. So to refer to them, to defend them because they're, I know people who are so simplistic that, well, they'll defend them because they're private companies. No, sometimes these private companies are the worst of all worlds. So they marry the profit motive with, with the government rulemaking, and keep that in mind in other reporting. Like, remember, with public utilities, regulated utilities are sorry, we got phone ringing. My apologies. Regulated utilities are functions of government regulation and control and monopoly. You can only have a monopoly if government creates that monopoly.
Yeah.
So you really couldn't have a monopoly situation in a true free market.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary, and it also speaks to the heart of why Uber matters not just for taxis, but for many other industries. Myself, I use Airbnb a lot. It's a service by which people rent out their apartments, and private people, not having to pay taxes or go to a hotel and pay all these expensive prices, can instead go and stay in New York City at a nice apartment for $50 a night. So that's something that is really important, and I think we covered it well. And I have to thank Steven Greenhut again of the UT of San Diego for talking to me about this. It's a great conversation, many more articles to come out of this, I'm certain. So thank you very much for taking your time, and I hope that the people listening were able to learn from it.
Thank you.
All right.